speaking on various different topics, but very much linked in different ways. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers and then engaging in discussion with them, maybe making some linkages between the papers, but also taking your questions from the chat box and putting them to the speakers we have. So the way we're going to organize this is each of the speakers will take about 10 or 15 minutes and give us a sort of a presentation to sort of set the scene for the first part of the evening, and then we'll have a more open-based discussion. So I will introduce all of the speakers first, and then we'll take the papers one by one. So first of all, our first speaker, Liz Gillis, is a historian and author from Dublin, and she's the author of 6 books about the Irish Revolutionary period, including The Fall of Dublin, Women of the Irish Revolution, The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, and May 25, The Burning of the Custom House in 1821. And Liz has worked as a researcher on various different publications and for radio and television documentaries. Our second speaker, Henry Patterson. Professor Henry Patterson is Emeritus Professor of Politics at Ulster University and the author of several books, including Ireland's Violent Frontier and The Politics of Illusion, A Political History of the IRA. And Henry's present research looks at the social and political history of unionism in North Down from the Home Rule period through to the Troubles. And I should have said this, our first speaker, I've got them mixed up, but our first speaker tonight is Dr. Síobhra Aiken. And Síobhra tonight's going to be exploring how revolutionaries anticipated the outbreak of the Civil War from before the treaty debates and how these anticipations shaped understanding of events to come. And Síobhra's first monograph, her first book, Spiritual Wounds, Trauma, Testimony, and the Irish Civil War, is forthcoming from Irish Academic Press this year. When are we due to see that, Síobhra?
I think in the next few weeks, Adrian. It's actually just in, so I think I'll have my copy next week. So.
That's great. Everyone keep an eye out for that now in the shops. It'll be a very, very interesting publication. So before before I invite Síobhra to begin, I just want to make a short statement about the ongoing university and college union strike. So some of you may be aware, others may not, that lecturers and workers at the higher education institutes in the UK, which includes Northern Ireland, are on strike this week and next and the week after. We're in dispute around pensions, pay, casualization, workload, and pay inequality. So it's a very, very important issue. You can see some of the stuff behind me that kind of points to that. So it's important that we make clear that the two people speaking here tonight, who are current staff members of the two universities in Northern Ireland, are speaking in an independent capacity, and that both of us are currently on strike and not representing our employers at this event. So I think it's just important to note that for everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that. Okay, Síobhra, if you want to take it away. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Adrian, and thanks to Grania for hosting this event. As Adrian said, I'm a lecturer in Queen's University Belfast, but I'm on strike this week, so I'm here in a more personal capacity. In order to open up this panel, I'll really be reflecting quite broadly on a few broad themes, I suppose, that we might be able to pick up on again in the discussion. And as Adrian said, I've a book that's just been published called Spiritual Wounds, Trauma, Testimony, and the Irish Civil War, and that reflects, I suppose, the work I was doing over the last 4 years or so as my doctoral research. And what I really focused on in the book is on veteran testimonies from the Irish Civil War, and also including fictionalized testimonies, and how there have been much more testimonies than previously acknowledged, and particularly how could it be that so much material has been included from historical scholarship to date. So I'm very much interested, I suppose, in that idea, the widespread idea that the Irish Civil War was followed by a traumatic silence in public discourse, but also in academic scholarship, and how that has included so much material, particularly from the 1920s and 1930s. So I'm looking at material, I suppose, that predates the Bureau of Military History and the military archives and the pension applications. So for today's paper, I'm not going to be necessarily reflecting on the material in the book. I just wanted to think of some more broad themes, I suppose, particularly if we're thinking back to 100 years to February 1922, what's happening in this period. So I'm sure, as many of you are already very well aware, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December 1921, which was followed by which was ratified then in the Dáil and led to the foundation of the Irish Free State on the 7th of January in 1922. And that led to what's referred to as the Irish Civil War, which lasted from June 1922 till May 1923. And I know Liz will be able to give a lot more details on the events of the Civil War itself, particularly in Dublin. And if we think of that in the broader context, again, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, of course, emerged from the Easter Rising of 1916, which was followed by the IRA guerrilla campaign, which set off, I suppose, in earnest from 1919. And that led ultimately to a truce in July 1921 and peace talks, which led to the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But what I'm interested in today is how that narrative of War of Independence, Irish Civil War, occludes a lot of the maybe complexities of the period. And Adrian used a good word there. I think that the meta narrative, the meta story that we consider, particularly when we might be looking at studying about this maybe at school level, and even we can think of the terminology itself, how contentious the terminology is. If we think of War of Independence, that might be contested in certain cases that for nationalists in the North, for example, the War of Independence didn't lead to independence. Equally, the Civil War is always conceived quite differently. There's no real consensus, as far as I can see, in terms of the actual dates for when the Civil War, particularly from when it ended. Did it end in April 1923? Was it May? We can say that it started in June 1922 with the Battle of the Four Courts, with the shelling of the Four Courts in Dublin. But we can say that there was evidence of civil war before that. And we also might step back again and say that there's examples of civil war, unacknowledged civil war throughout this period, if we want to think of it in cases of whether that might be the targeting of spies and informers by the IRA, if we think of it in terms of violence against women, if that's Irish on Irish violence, the targeting and haircropping of Irish women, for example, by the IRA. And we might think of it again in terms of arson, if we think of the burning of the big houses, but also in terms of destruction of property and little houses more generally. And again, in terms of the terminology of the Irish Civil War, even the terminology, again, it is contested. Both pro and anti-treaty sides didn't necessarily agree with the terminology of the Civil War. The anti-treaty side may have seen the Civil War as a continuation of the previous struggle against the British, and the pro-treaty side felt that the Civil War terminology gave the other side a legitimacy that maybe that they didn't deserve. And then we might say again that when we think of civil war as a division between pro and anti-treaty, we're actually missing other perspectives on the treaty also. That, for example, the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, was not the only military force, for example, that opposed the Free State Army. There was also the Irish Citizen Army, and then again the Red Army in Dublin again, and that aren't always featured prominently when we're thinking of this period. So that brings us on, I suppose, to what's happening in what was to become Northern Ireland as well during this period, because if we think of the truce in July 1921, that certainly did not mark the end of violence on the island. And I know that Henry's going to speak about this in a lot more detail. But I'll just say that the signing of the announcement of the truce in July 1921 was followed subsequently that month with some of the worst violence, as Catholic workers were expelled from their workplaces, both in the shipyards and other areas of employment. And this continued throughout 1922. And I think Kieran Glennon is here, who has obviously done a huge amount of work on this. Some of you may have read in the Irish Times this week the article by Cormac Moore on the events of February 1922 in Belfast, which witnessed one of the worst atrocities, as 4 girls and 2 women were killed on Weaver Street. And we can also look at other atrocities that were committed during the period against Protestants, famously at Alton Bay and South Armagh in the summer of 1922, during what is referred to as the Truce, where 6 locals were killed in their homes. These events, I think, have had little place in the dominant commemorative narrative of Ireland's revolutionary period. And I think a line from Cormac Moore's article in the Irish Times is interesting, that not only was Ireland partitioned in 1921, but the history on the island was also partitioned. And I think that's particularly relevant when we're talking about that terminology of the Irish Civil War. It's often conceived of as the Irish Civil War in the South between pro and anti-treaty sides. So as I said, the intricacies of these events will be developed a little bit more further in the next papers. But I just want to think about how that narrative of Irish Civil War was constructed and how it was simultaneously a dominant narrative, that this idea of the Civil War was something that very much has a shadow across how the Easter Rising is remembered, how the War of Independence is remembered, but also a narrative that was characterized by a silence, yet a silence that was often loquaciously expressed, that was expressed quite loudly, which I think is quite interesting. So I'm just going to show a few examples of what I'm talking about in terms of this silence from the Bureau of Military History, and I'll pull up my slides now, if that's okay. So that should be visible to see there. Is this, if someone can give me a nod, just so I know that that's okay. I'll presume that you can see that okay. But what I've selected here is just a few examples in the Bureau of Military History where we see veterans expressing their desire not to refer to the Irish Civil War. And I think these are all very noteworthy because in expressing their desire to not acknowledge the Civil War, they're actually drawing more attention to it. And I think this is the paradox of the Irish Civil War, the remembering of the Irish Civil War and the forgetting, what Guy Biner refers to the paradox of intentional forgetting, that the desire or commitment to forget paradoxically draws attention to that which is supposedly forgotten. Some examples here are Peter Wood's "This brings me to the eve of the Civil War, with which I do not want to deal." John Grant, who's captain of the IRA in Armagh, says, "I have no desire to deal in any more detail with any engagements I had with former comrades during the Civil War. But I do want to place on record that I took the Republican side." And I think we can see there how the Civil War is also a strong feature of those Northerners, as he refers to himself here. But also that in this case, the desire to forget the Civil War is actually a disclaimer, because even though he says he doesn't want to express or address it, he does set the record straight nevertheless and does address his role. Then we have an example from Chaplain Aloysius Travers, and like many, he says he does not want to remember the sad days of Civil War and bitter strife, and he calls on his audience to try and forget what is painful. Let us remember what is heartening and inspiring. And what's interesting here is this binary here that we can see by Father Travers, this idea to forget what is painful and to remember what is heartening and inspiring. We can be seen as one of the major characteristics of this period, of the revolutionary period, if that's what we want to call it, in terms of what is heartening and inspiring, that the War of Independence is created as a heartening and inspiring war to be remembered, while that is painful is associated with Civil War and committed to oblivion. And this reflects broader narratives that have been summed up quite well by David Armitage, who is, I suppose, one of the foremost theorists of Civil War. And he reflects on the fact that this binary between Civil War and revolution really intensifies from the age of revolution in the late 18th century, and that Civil War is associated with historical amnesia. It's associated with blighting and the collapse of human spirit, whereas revolution is characterized by revelation and self-realization. In the Irish context, however, we can say that the heartening and the inspiring and the painful are often interconnected, that there isn't this gap between their two, but nevertheless that there are attempts to set up this binary, I suppose. And what I referred to in the blurb, I think, that I sent on to Grania, as well, is the idea that this narrative based around the Civil War, this narrative of silence and particularly of trauma, is actually not necessarily related to the extremity of the events, that this narrative already existed before some of the key events that occurred in the Irish Civil War. And this reflects what Guy Reiner refers to as pre-memory. That's to say that events are remembered and they are simulated according to memories of previous events. And this is very much pertinent in the context of Civil War, because there's already a narrative of Civil War that's set up as brothers divided, that is set up as uniquely traumatic. And this bears out in very interesting ways, actually. So if we look at the newspaper material, for example, in early 1922, 100 years ago from today, we can see that there's many references to the unspeakability of civil war and the threat of civil war and how civil war divides and ruins communities. This is before any of the major events that we associate with the Irish Civil War had occurred, for example, the atrocities in Kerry and Ballyseedy. But we see it even earlier again. We see references to civil war in the context of the 1918 elections, and for example, the general election, that there are calls to that civil war is horrible and unspeakable, and that civil war among rival chiefs in the 12th century led to destruction in Ireland. So we have a harking back to previous civil wars, in this case, among rival chiefs in the 12th century. And again, we see this in some of the documentation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And Liam Deasy, for example, in his memoir, Brother Against Brother, describes the Anglo-Irish Treaty through the lens of the Treaty of Limerick of 1691. So we have all these previous narratives of civil war, both nationally and internationally, that are filtering through these events, and these reflect not only how these events are remembered, but also how these events play out in real time also. What I mentioned there is a lot of this civil war, I don't think I can see the images there for some reason, but a lot of this civil war narrative is based around a brother against brother motif, which again goes back to Roman times. And unfortunately, I'm not sure why, but my images haven't shown up here. But this is evident in some of the earliest reportings, that the civil war is presented in images again as a battle between two male figures, and we see it in early newspaper reporting between Mulcahy and De Valera, and then later on we see Michael Collins and De Valera, and this split between two male figures, that they are split over these terms, and this obviously very sturdy masculine motif not only includes that there are often more than one sides within a civil war, but it also includes the many unacknowledged civil wars, and whether that might be the realities of partition that we've mentioned, the experiences of women, including experiences of sexual violence, Irish violence, agrarian violence, destruction, arson, and so on. And there's really many, I suppose, what we could refer to as sites of oblivion that are occluded by the construction of this brother against brother narrative. So for the purpose of the remaining few minutes, and I've probably gone a little bit over already, I want to reflect on two sites of oblivion, which I think deserve more attention. And the first one is the fact that if we go back to this week, 100 years ago, the headlines in the newspapers were not what was happening in the treaty, not maybe political violence that we might expect, but actually the threat of famine in the west of Ireland, and something that I don't think has been picked up on. I've looked at it a little bit in one of the figures I've written about in the book, because he's highly involved in the Gaelic League, and in early 1922 he was organising a campaign to send money over to Connemara. But we can just see on the newspaper reporting that the 10th of February here from the Irish Independent, 18 human beings and 4 cattle and a hovel, 2 children and a donkey passing the night in a room 20 by 12 existence on 2 meals of potatoes that elsewhere would not be fed to the pigs. The men sick in silent despair, that women alone vocal. And we can see that there in Mishnach, which was the newspaper of the Gaelic League, Goethe. It's on their front page news on the 18th of February 1922. And that brings me up just to the other points that I wanted to reflect on, particularly in the context of, as Adrian said, that we're involved in industrial disputes at the moment. But if the plight of the working people has been overlooked in the downplaying, I suppose, of the dread of famine, the efforts to improve working conditions in the new state have equally been sidelined. One of the first industrial strikes in 1922 was the postal worker strike, which occurred in September. And the postal unions were striking back against pay cuts within the new Free State at the height of the Civil War. And really the response was quite draconian, and the right to strike was not recognised, and military was used to remove the strikers. And the writer Jim Phelan, like many, he sardonically commented that the only change introduced by the foundation of the Free State was that the post boxes that were previously red had been painted green. Yet, so despite such symbolic idea, I suppose, of progress, as we can see here with the postal worker strike, the conditions for the workers in the post offices deteriorated and continued to do so through the early years of the Irish Free State, and they are engaged in many more strike actions throughout the 1930s. And then within that narrative also, if we say that there's a downplaying of workers' rights, and the binary of pro versus anti-treaty also conceals that in the Battle of Dublin, for example, there were three bodies, as I mentioned, who opposed the Free State Army, not only the anti-treaty IRA, also the Citizen Army and the Red Army, which is associated with the Communist Party of Ireland. And again, even during the period itself, there was an acknowledgement that there was not a significant recognition for these diverse perspectives on the treaty. So I think I'll finish on that note, and maybe Liz can give us more information on that. But there are just a few of, I suppose, ideas in terms of the construction of this narrative of the Civil War, and a few of the sites of oblivion within that meta-narrative.
Thank you very much, Síobhra, for that. Really, really interesting presentation. And there's lots within that, I think, excuse me, there's lots within that, I think, that we can pick up on as we go through the evening. I'm particularly interested in the stories of the famine conditions, you know, and what came after. The green postbox narrative is always interesting to look at in terms of what actually happened after that. So what we're going to do is we'll move on to our next speaker, and we're going to come back to all of those issues that we pick up on throughout the presentations. And again, feel free to put any thoughts or questions in the chat box as we go through. I'll keep a note of them here, and we can come back to them then towards the end. I'll introduce our next speaker now, Henry Patterson. Of course, I've already introduced him, but introducing him for the purposes of letting him know that he's up next. But Henry is intending to focus on the issue of Ulster Unionist insecurity, particularly in the period following the truce. So take it away there, Henry.
Right, thanks, Adrian. It's pretty difficult to deal with unionism in general in this period in about 20 minutes or 15 minutes, right? So one way in, I thought I'd go into it, was this issue of security, insecurity in terms of physical insecurity, existential, constitutional insecurity. There's lots of different types of insecurity. And the reason I picked this was, some of you, probably a lot of you will have read Joan White's book, Interpreting Northern Ireland. And in the conclusion of that book, he asked this question: why is research on Northern Ireland not been more effective? And he gives a number of reasons. And the first one is that people don't read research. And I was reminded of this comment about a month ago. I was reading an article by Susan McKay in The Guardian, which was fundamentally to do with current unionist attitudes to the Northern Ireland and Loyalist attitudes to Northern Ireland Protocol. But in the year that was in it, she made a centenary comparison, which was that in comparison today, where unionists are demoralized, insecure about their future, when the state was set up in 1921, unionists felt secure, which was, to me, a surprising assertion. Because if we think back from about 45 years since the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland introduced a 30-year rule, and we had a massive opening up of the files, the archives of the Northern Ireland State and the main government departments. And that in the immediate aftermath of that, Bew, Gibbon and myself wrote State of Northern Ireland. Patrick Buckland wrote The Factory of Grievances, Devolved Government in Northern Ireland. And Michael Farrell wrote Arming the Protestants. And there's lots of interpretive differences between these books. But I think you couldn't read any of them and come away with the idea that the Unionist position at any time really from the spring of 1920 through until June 1923, and months and even years after it, was based on any sense of security. In fact, a better summing up of the Unionist mentality in this period, rather florid one, was given by the English civil servant Stephen Tallants, who was sent over by Lord George after the collapse of the two Craig Collins pacts in January and March of 1922. And in his report, which was published at the end of June 1922, he wrote, "The Protestant community of the North feel that it is an outpost of civilization set precariously on the frontiers of Bolshevism. It believes that the British government has portrayed it, and at best its cause is misunderstood in England." I think this sense of insecurity obviously goes back at least until the spring of 1920 with the onset of the IRA campaign in the North. But I think there's a qualitative transformation in the situation after the truce of July 1921. In the autumn of 21, with the special constabulary out of operation, they were stood down as part of the truce. The RIC demoralized on the road to disbandment. The military virtually confined to barracks. You get an upsurge of various loyalist vigilante groups. And if you read the Unionist press in the autumn, September, October, November 1922, there's a lot of talk about the reorganization of the UVF, the mobilization of ex-servicemen to try and deal with what was perceived as an increased military threat from the IRA. So basically what I want to look at in terms of this insecurity is I think there's a dualistic response within unionism to constitutional or paramilitary threats. One is the unionist, and one element of that, which is pretty decisive in this period from late, say, October, November 1921 through until June of 1922, is plebeian, loyalist, working class violence, which is first manifest in this period, not first manifest, but first manifest in this period in the shipyard expulsions of July 1920. In November 1921, there's a lot of coverage in the Unionist press of an organization called the Ulster Imperial Guard. In Brendan O'Leary's, the second volume of Brendan O'Leary's Treatise in Northern Ireland, he refers to the Imperial Guard as a loyalist death squad. In fact, the Imperial Guard was an organization, I think, stimulated by the Unionist leadership to put pressure on the British government at the time. It was made up of former UVF men and Unionist ex-servicemen. It was launched in the 15th of November 1921 by 10 church parades in all the main Protestant districts of Belfast. It involved approximately 20,000 marchers. It was they marched to the city centre, and there were two mass meetings, one chaired by the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Sir Victor Coates, and the other by Ulster Unionist Labour MP, William Grant. None of the Unionist MPs could be at it because they were all in London, because a week before, Craig had been called to London by Lord George and asked and put under pressure in the interest of the broader peace in Ireland to agree to come under an Irish government, right? in the greater interests of the British Empire, to consolidate what Lord George and key faction in the government at the time saw as the more reasonable element of the leadership of Sinn Féin. And it's in response to this pressure that this Imperial Guard is set up. Now, the organization doesn't appear to have lasted more than 3 months. Its purpose seems to have been largely to mobilize Unionists. It's after it, the member, 200 or 300 of people who participate in it were sent to the Conservative and Unionist annual conference in Liverpool, which has taken place at the end of November, to put pressure on the Unionist members of the coalition government to oppose any attempt to put the North under a Dublin government. It worked in that sense. The pressure on Craig and his government decreased. At the end of the month, the government functions, which had been held back after the treaty, were transferred to Belfast. The specials who had been stood down were remobilized. So this mobilization had real important political effects. If you look at the people who participated, a core and important element manifest by the role of William Grant was Loyalist, the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. And it's the relationship between the Unionist leadership and this militant loyalist tradition that I think in a sense provides an important kernel of truth in a narrative which in other ways I would contest about this period in terms of if the pogrom narrative of what occurred in Belfast between July 1920 and June 1923. Because really, at least from the riots in Belfast in 1886, which were predominantly a riot of shipyard workers and other working class Protestants against the RIC, but which began with shipyard workers attacking Catholic labourers. There had been a sort of Faustian pact between the Unionist middle class, industrial class, merchants and bankers, and, if you like, an autonomous tradition of plebeian loyalist violence. From a Unionist perspective, from the leadership's perspective, you can see this in 1893 and 1912, because of the, in a sense, the bad publicity for the Unionist cause, the violence of 1886 had produced in the rest of the United Kingdom. There's a recognition of the need to discipline and control this tradition of plebeian violence. That is partly the function of the UVF in 1912, 13, 14. And it's certainly a key part of the motivation of Unionist leadership for the formation of the Special Constabulary in September, October 1920. But within this tradition, there is certainly no clear Chinese wall between loyalist labor and the sort of loyalist murder gangs that were on the rampage in the period, really, particularly in the period from February to June 1923. The Imperial Guard was not a murder gang. Grant had been at the forefront of loyalist workplace mobilization against home rulers, against liberals, against socialists from at least 1912 onwards. So I think what in fact happens and why it's important to register insecurity is to see that there is this relationship within unionism and loyalism of tension, the necessity to mobilize, perceived necessity on the part of unionist leadership to mobilize across classes in the face of this threat. And the existence within sections of the Protestant working class of a tradition of what can be at times quite savage violence. To not register the broader context of insecurity, of which a formative and key element was the IRA campaign, makes it, I think, too easy to see plebeian violence as something which leadership can turn off and turn on almost at will, which unionist newspapers can encourage and which unionist leaders can sponsor. That wasn't the case. I can go into that and talk about that in terms of questions if people want to raise it. There's a lot of other issues after the treaty, which I think have gone over my time. So we can perhaps talk about the effect of the treaty and unionist attitude to the treaty. I've got material here I can discuss if people want to. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Henry. Very, very interesting arguments put forward there and ideas put forward, I think, on the whole notion of unionist insecurity. It'll be interesting to to see what people think of that notion of insecurity at that time. I know from my own perspective, from having researched the period, it's quite clear to me, at least, that the actions of the Northern Ireland state in its infancy are not the actions of a secure power. That's for sure. But it'd be interesting to have that discussion as we go through. I'll move on now to our final speaker, who's been waiting patiently. This is Liz Gillis, who I introduced earlier. And Liz is going to speak to us about various different aspects of the Civil War in the main, which brings us forward a little bit in time. So it'll be interesting now to hear from Liz and what she has to tell us about events of that period, as well as some interesting stories from along the border too. So thanks very much, Liz, and you can go ahead there now.
Thanks a million, Adrian. So I'm just going to share my screen and oh, it's gone. Hang on. Sorry, Adrian. No. Sorry, just going to get this presentation up.
Yeah.
Okay. And Zoom.
Nothing yet.
No, Zoom strikes again. Hang on, Adrian.
Oh, I'm seeing. There we go. That's it.
That's it. Okay, lovely. So yeah, I'm just going to thanks, Adrian, for the introduction and everyone for organising this. But yeah, I'm just going to talk about some of the key events and so on that happened in the Civil War. But I'm just going to start with a photograph, because this photograph actually sums up the whole tragedy of the Civil War and sort of leads into what I'm going to talk about, which is like the three different sort of phases of the Civil War, where literally it descends as the Civil War goes on. So here we have the wedding photograph of Tom Barry and Leslie Price. Tom Barry, of course, being the commandant of the 3rd West Cork Brigade Flying Column, and then Leslie Price, who was a member of Cumann na mBan from Dublin, but she was attached to the West Cork Brigade of the IRA. And this photograph, or this wedding, was one of many that took place during the truce in 1921. And this photograph is a who's who of giants of the revolution. But although it's celebrating a very happy occasion, it is a very, very sad photograph, because we look on a year later and the country at that time was in the midst of the Civil War. And just the 4 people that are circled, they were all to die in the early days of the conflict. So here we have Harry Boland's front row. So he dies soon after the fighting for Dublin starts in July 1922. And he's on the anti-treaty side, killed out in Skerries. That's very quickly followed by the death of Michael Collins down in Cork. Now, what is significant here also about this photograph is the date. Tom Barry and Leslie Price are married on the 22nd of August 1921. A year later, when they're celebrating, or meant to be celebrating their 1st wedding anniversary, Tom is in prison on the anti-treaty side, having been arrested. Leslie is walking away with the anti-treaty Cumann na mBan, and it's also the day that Michael Collins dies down in Cork. We then have Sean Hales, pro-treaty, who was assassinated in Dublin on the 7th of December 1922, trying to sort of discover what actually happened down in Cork in August. And then the very next day, we have this man circled here, Rory O'Connor, who was executed in Mountjoy Jail as a result of the assassination of Sean Hales in Dublin. So that photograph, although a memory or a moment of happiness, is also a very tragic photograph, seeing as we know what happens later on. So I suppose the Civil War, as Síobhra said, there's many dates that can be seen as the beginning of the Civil War, because so many things were happening in the lead up to the actual date that we sort of associate, which is 28th of June 1922, when the attack on the Four Courts begins, which had been occupied by members of the anti-treaty IRA on the 14th of April 1922. Roy O'Connor, Ernie O'Malley and so on, members of the anti-treaty executive, occupied the Four Courts. In Roy O'Connor's words, It wasn't a coup. It was very symbolic because this is the last symbol of British, administration in Ireland. One of the few buildings that hadn't been destroyed in the previous 6 years. But his words were they needed a bigger headquarters where they were stationed previously wasn't suitable. But about 120 men occupied that. And there's a, it's a symbolic act. But from what you're going to see next, as in these photographs, it wasn't like the anti-treaty IRA who were in there were expecting a fight to begin. Now, these photographs are taken of the anti-treaty IRA in the four courts between April and June 1922. There we've got lads posing on the roof of the four courts. Here we have them posing on the captured armoured car, the Mutineer, that they had taken. Earlier, Malley was involved in that. And there's loads of these photographs. So the build-up, the lead-up to June, you have all these efforts from both sides to avert something that pretty much was inevitable. But these photographs don't show people who are believing that a war is imminent. But then it comes, 28th of June, 1922, the attack on the four courts begins, because despite the fact that you had Henry Wilson shot by the IRA over in England, and you had pressure being put on Collins and the provisional government by the British to get them out of four courts, get the anti-treaty out of there, IRA out of there, they wouldn't until it's one of their own that is affected. And that was the kidnapping of Ginger O'Connell by the anti-treaty IRA. That was in response to the arrest of Henderson, an anti-treaty figure who had been sent out to raid a garage for cars. An ultimatum had been given to the executive inside to surrender, and they didn't. And then 4 o'clock on the morning of 28th June, the attack begins, the shelling begins. It lasts for 3 days. By the 30th of June, the four courts was taken. As you can see from this photograph, the whole building pretty much goes up. You have the records office where the munitions factory was. That goes up first, and then of course you have the massive explosion with the dome. But with the four courts going up and the arrest of the garrison, the fighting doesn't end there, because while the four courts had been occupied, you also had the anti-treaty IRA taking over positions in and around Dublin City, predominantly in O'Connell Street, in an area that became known as the Block. So where we have the Gresham Hotel now to what's now Burger King, that was the Block. And you have Cal Brewer and you have Todd Andrews, and you've got lots and lots of anti-treaty IRA people there, also members of Cumann and Mon, also members of the Irish Citizen Army, all in this building and buildings surrounding. So once the focus shifts from the four courts, it goes to the Block, where you have until the 7th of July massive concentrating of fighting there, and of course then the pro-treaty side is victorious. But it's in that period then we have the death of Cathal Brewer, who was in charge of the garrison in the Block. And then once Dublin is taken control of, you have then the fight moving to the outskirts of County Dublin, south and north. Hence it leads to Harry Boland getting shot out in Skerries, and then there's major events that happen towards Tallaght and Rathfarnham. The fighting moves there, and this is the way the initial sort of stages of the Civil War are fought. You have the staged battles, and then you have the reverting, the anti-treaty IRA reverting to guerrilla tactics that were so successful in the War of Independence. And then we have the death of Michael Collins in August 1922. I'll come to that in 1 second. But while that is all happening, you also have prisoners being arrested up and down the country. The prisons are starting to fill up with anti-treaty prisoners, men and women. But there is quite a number of men that are arrested from Derry in July 1922. And this is as a result of the violence that they're finding themselves coming under, not due to the Civil War, but due to the events in Derry, the violence against the Be from the Be Special and so on, the raids that are being carried out. And here's some of the letters that I found in National Archives about these men, because what had happened was they had armed themselves to protect themselves against the attacks from the Specials, and they went across the border from Derry to Donegal. But who's there? Only Joe Sweeney, who is the commandant in the National Army. He sees this group of our men walking around. He assumes, because they had been members of the IRA previously, that they're anti-treaty IRA, so they're arrested and then they're transferred down to Dublin, apparently at great expense. They end up as prisoners in Kilmainham jail. But these letters show that the men are given the reason for why they were armed. It's not to fight against the state. It's actually to protect themselves. But the national or the provincial government don't know what to do with these men. The White Cross get involved and they interview the men. There is basically there's promising that they won't take up arms and they just want to get back. They can't go back to their homestead because it's unsafe for them. They're worried about their families because they've got wives, they've got kids. Who's going to look after them? The National Army don't know what to do with them. The provincial government don't know what to do with them. They can't afford to send them back up. So the option is give them the choice to join the National Army if they prove that they won't, act against the National Army or the provincial government. Give them that option. If they won't join, then treat them as refugees, but then it comes back to money. This goes on for a couple of months. By September, this is the last correspondence that I have, the men weren't set free. The men didn't join the National Army, it seems, because they're still in Gormanstown internment camp. So maybe Adrian might be able to find out what did happen to those men. But it's just a really interesting story that has been overlooked in the general narrative of the Civil War. And if you do visit Kilmainham, in the East Wing, there is inscriptions, graffiti above the cell doors, and there is inscriptions, or are inscriptions, relating to the border between Donegal and Derry. You've got Bournefolk, Carndon, and so on. So it's quite possible that some of those men that were in the jail at that time are those men who were talked about in these letters. Sort of the next phase, or entering into the next phase, it is August, September 1922, and we're talking about divided loyalties. We're talking about the Civil War being a war of brother against brother. But as we know, everyone was affected by this. Women were just as much affected by the Civil War. Friendships broke down. Women never spoke to their friends again. Sisters were against each other and so on. But a family that symbolises the divide of the Civil War is the Hales family from West Cork. And here we have them showing the split. So you have Sean Hales and his sister Madge who go pro-treaty, but then we have the other siblings, Tom, Robert, Liam and Donald, who is in Italy, all going anti-treaty. But this family are involved in events that will change the course of the Civil War, have terrible effects on how the Civil War goes on. And it is directly connected to Collins. So Collins is down in West Cork doing his tour, he's meeting up with all of his comrades and so on. And he's doing the tour of West Cork, and one of the last places that he visits is Bandon, and he goes to what is now the Munster Arms Hotel. It's still there, it was Lee's Hotel, where he meets Sean Hales. Now, the Munster Republic at that stage, it was very, very dangerous down in West Cork. Sean Hales, it is his terrain. He tells Collins, basically, it's too dangerous to go back to Cork City the way he was planning on go another way, but Collins didn't listen to him. Now, while Sean Hales is the last person to see Collins before he sets off on that fateful journey towards Bale-na-Blah, Tom Hales' brother is waiting at Bale-na-Blah because he's overseeing the preparation of the ambush that will eventually be the ambush that Collins dies in. So here we have two brothers on opposite sides being involved in an event that does change the course of the Civil War, because with the death of Collins, it's like Collins was a buffer keeping a lid on a very explosive situation. And shortly after Collins dies, you then have a focus on from the National Army against Na Fianna, who predominantly were anti-treaty, who are seen as a real threat because Na Fianna, the younger generation, they would feed into the ranks of the anti-treaty IRA. So within 2 or 3 days of Collins' death, you have two Fianna members being killed, being murdered by members of the National Army. And then that sets a trend that will follow over the coming months. Sean Hales had questions about what happened down at Bale-na-Blah. He was trying to see if questions could be raised in the Dáil. The Dáil, of course, wasn't sitting at this time. It did meet, I think, on the 5th or 6th December. He's up in Dublin, is making his way from the Ormond Hotel with Sean O'Muirla, who was the Count Quarla, and they were going to ask questions. As Sean Hales and Sean O'Muirla are coming out of Sean O'Malley, are coming out of the Ormond Hotel, O'Malley is Porrick O'Malley, he's called back. Sean Hales gets into the Jarvey that had been called, and literally at that moment, members of the anti-treaty IRA come out of the laneway, open fire, and Sean Hales gets the full brunt of it, and he dies within minutes. The actual target was O'Malley, because what we have here, this document, the more the members, as you see here, this is in reference to the emergency legislation that was brought in by the provisional government in September 1922, that basically meant anyone found with a gun or explosives could be executed. And any TD who voted for that bill or that legislation was a legitimate target in the eyes of the anti-treaty IRA, target for assassination. Hence, we have O'Malley being the target, but it's actually Sean Hales that dies. He didn't vote on that bill. He wasn't the actual target. However, this has dire consequences, his assassination, because the very next day, the provisional government sent a message to the anti-treaty IRA that this is not going to be accepted now. And they take choose four men from Mountjoy Jail who had been in custody since the 30th of June, because they'd been taken when the four courts, the garrison surrendered there. And we have Dick Barrett, we have Joe McKelvey, Roy O'Connor, and Liam Mellows. And each of these men was to represent a province, so to send the message to the whole of Ireland. Dick Barrett was from West Cork, so he's Munster. Joe McKelvey, Tyrone, so he's Ulster. Roy O'Connor was Leinster, and then Liam Mellows is Connacht. Now, there is so much tragedy with this, because 4 men taken out, they were executed by firing squad in Mountjoy Jail. Dick Barrett was a very good friend of Sean Hales. Even the family of Sean Hales wrote letters saying this is not what he would have wanted, his very good friend dying as a result of what happened to him. And then, of course, we have Rory O'Connor and Kevin O'Higgins. Now, Kevin O'Higgins and O'Connor, very good friends. This is the wedding photograph of Kevin O'Higgins, again, a year before. Rory O'Connor was the best man at O'Higgins' wedding. They split on the issue of the treaty. Kevin O'Higgins was a minister in the provisional government. And when it came to the decision on the vote on whether these executions should happen, it was Kevin O'Higgins that's the last one to agree to it. So he basically sanctions the execution of his best friend. So here we see the relationship divided, but then we enter the chaos of the Civil War, because from late December 22 right to the end of the Civil War, the gloves were off on both sides. Now, we have W.T. Cosgrave at the time of the assassination of Hales. He actually said in the newspaper report that he and the Minister for Defence, Richard Mulcahy, were going to appeal to the anti-treaty IRA to give up the fight. They would give them clemency, but once Sean Hales was killed, that was it. W.T. Cosgrave was going to smash them. And this is then what happens, or how we see it descending again from late December right through to 23. But you can see it starting to descend prior to that. And there were so many atrocities that happened in the Civil War. But one of the tragic events that happened was the killings of the 3 members of Na Fianna out at the Red Cow in Clondalkin in October 1922. And this is when the anti-treaty IRA were having successes against the pro-treaty side. They were targeting the family homes of the provisional government, the TDs, and they were carrying out successful ambushes against the National Army. But you do have a gang that is operating in Dublin where anti-treaty IRA Fianna are being taken off the streets and their bodies are being found dumped. And this is the case, what happens at the Red Cow. 3 boys who had been putting up posters out in Drumcondra, basically threatening the lives of any National Army soldier living in the area, that if they were seen, they would be killed. Unfortunately, when they're putting up these posters, they're met by 2 National Army soldiers, one of them being Charlie Dalton, who lives in the area. And they're taken to Wellington Barracks, which was notorious barracks, and there was brutal interrogations that took place there. And the very next day, the 7th of October, 3 bodies were found out in a quarry in Clondalkin near the Red Cow. Brendan Hughes, we have Edwin Hughes, Brendan Holohan, and we have another chap, Joseph Rogers. Now, they'd all been members of Na Fianna. Joseph Rogers was 16 years old, and all 3 were shot, but Rogers was shot 16 times. There was inquest that followed, but the inquest just found, guilty or sort of willful murder by persons unknown, and unfortunately, that was the trend that would follow over the coming months. And then we fast forward to, I suppose, the event that really symbolizes the whole horror of how this descended so badly, and it is the events in Kerry in March 1923. Now, everyone sort of refers to Ballyseedy, Carsiveen, Clashmelkin Caves, all of that. But when we look at those tragedies, what has been sort of overlooked in that narrative of those events is what happened at Knocknagoshel, because it's not to justify these events, but to understand how something like this can happen. But there seems to be something that sparks it off, and it is the trap mine at Knocknagoshel, laid by the anti-treaty IRA to kill a member of the National Army, Paddy Pats O'Connor, who was very, very active against the anti-treaty IRA in Kerry. Unfortunately, the Dublin Guards were stationed in Kerry at that time, and a trap had been set that there was an arms dump at this location in Knocknagoshel, but the arms dump was mined. So Paddy Pats O'Connor with this patrol go out to investigate. He's accompanied by 2 Dublin Guards. The Dublin Guards were veterans of the War of Independence. Some of them were the assassins in Collins' squad. And when they lift it up, the dump, the mine goes off. Paddy Pats O'Connor and the others are killed, including the 2 Dublin Guards. But for the anti-treaty IRA in Kerry, this was an awful, awful mistake, because the Dublin Guards are in Kerry. Paddy Daly, Dave Nelligan, all of these guys. And they literally now they go on the rampage, and they send a message to all of Kerry that all of Kerry's going to pay for Knocknagoshel. So the 3 Kerry brigades are hit: Kerry number 1, Kerry number 2, Kerry number 3. That night, that's the 6th and 7th of March, you have 9 prisoners taken out of Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee. They're taken to Ballyseedy Cross. They're placed around the mine. The mine goes up. 8 people die. 1, Stephen Fuller, is blown clear. He survives. The very same night at Countess Bridge in Killarney, you have 5 IRA prisoners anti-treaty taken out there, again to clear the roads, but the roads had been mined. Again, the mines go off and 4 are killed. 1 is blown clear. There's 2 survivors, but the pro-treaty side thought that everyone died. Do you see here the newspaper reports 12 regular prisoners killed removing barricades in Kerry, hidden death traps explode, 2 national officers, a sergeant, 2 privates wounded. Now, when the National Army realised then that there actually were survivors, so the established narrative is now differing to what is now being said, because there were survivors, and it's not that they were cleared in road mines and they had been mined and that it accidentally went off. It's a deliberate act of murder. What they did then to make sure that all of the Kerry brigades suffered for Knocknagoshel, you have the event at Carsiveen, where the prisoners were taken out and they were shot in the legs and then placed on the mine so no one could get away. And the sort of revenge for Knocknagoshel continues right up until the end of the Civil War. As the ceasefire is announced, you have a person that was connected to the Knocknagoshel trap mine being shot and killed by the pro-treaty forces. And I suppose what the Civil War, if we look at it, the tragedy of it is who was lost. So many were lost in the Civil War. People who had survived 1916, people who had survived War of Independence. What the British couldn't do, it was our own that did that. And in the case of Cathal Brugha, very prophetically, he makes a speech where he says he hopes it will be by a British bullet or an orange bullet that he will die, but not one fired by his own. And despite the fact that he was wounded 25 times in 1916 by, shrapnel from grenades and bullets in South Dublin Union, it took 1 bullet in the Civil War fired by a former friend to kill Cathal Brugha. But just to end on a positive note, because there are positive stories as well. And it is this story of 2 men, 2 friends who were on opposite sides in the Civil War, but whose friendship survived the Civil War. We have Pádraig O'Connor and Paddy Rigney, both members of the 4th Battalion of Dublin Brigade of the IRA. Pádraig goes pro-treaty, Paddy goes anti-treaty. Pádraig is the one that leads the attack on the 4 courts from the National Army side. In the 4 courts is his friend, Paddy Rigney. The photograph of Paddy Rigney is actually him lying on top of the 4 courts. When the 4 courts garrison surrendered, they're taken to Smithfield, the Jameson distillery there. And amongst the prisoners, Pádraig O'Connor sees his friend Paddy Rigney and he decides he's going to get him out. So we open the side door, says to Paddy Rigney, get out. I've made it possible for you to escape, thinking that it's only Paddy that's going to walk out. But Paddy spreads the word, and with him go Ernie O'Malley, Sean Lamass, and a few others. Tom Derrick, I think, is another one. That was not the only time that Pádraig O'Conor saved the life of his friend during the Civil War, because Paddy Rigney was very active, and he was arrested a number of times. There was one time that was most likely he was going to be executed, and Pádraig O'Conor stepped in. So I suppose just to finish up, it is that the Civil War has 3 phases. It descended and descended and descended, but in some cases, there was that little sense of positivity that people did survive, that friendships, relationships did survive, despite the whole turmoil of what was going on in the country at that time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Liz. That's very, very interesting detail of what went on during the Civil War. And I think you'll all agree that we've had a great sort of spectrum of coverage there of various different aspects of this period. There's plenty to discuss as we have about 20 minutes or so left, so plenty of time to have a discussion. I have the privilege of kind of steering the discussion now, so I thought I would start by coming back to the issue of post-conflict memory and how that kind of permeates a lot of both this time period and the period that we currently live in. You know, there were references throughout the papers to the way in which we remember and the way in which things were even beginning to be remembered at the time. So if I could come to you first, Síobhra, you mentioned there the issues of starvation type narratives coming out of the west of Ireland, Connemara and places like that, and the strikes that were taking place at that time as well. Do you think there's a reason why maybe we don't focus on that in terms of maybe the public narrative of the Civil War? We all know that the memory of the Civil War was sort of suppressed for a long time because of the trauma of it in the South, but we also know that there's that undercurrent of a different type of history maybe that hasn't been addressed in the public narrative to the same extent. Do you have any thoughts on maybe an explanation for that, or is that too big a question for a Wednesday evening?
No, that's great, Adrian. I think the first thing to say is that it's not abnormal maybe that there is at least a narrative of silence, or even if there is a silence or not, that's something we can talk about in a minute. But it isn't abnormal for this idea that a particularly catastrophic or devastating event would be followed by a period of silence, and that might even go back to practices of mourning. That idea of in the wake of death or destruction, that there's maybe a silence of honouring the dead. It also reflects psychological discourse, medical discourse, the idea of traumatic mutism, which actually is a condition, I suppose, that these ideas again were circulating in the aftermath of the First World War, that a particularly traumatic event might lead to a shock that challenges speech. And we see how these ideas are then reflected onto communal events, which I think is quite interesting. These maybe pseudo-psychology ideas become reflected in that there's a sense that certain events are experienced as a trauma by the entire community. And I think that's very interesting, the way that's constructed, and that would be referred to a cultural trauma, because that's only constructed if it's mediated, whether that's by newspapers or community and interactions, that something is seen to be of a very significant trauma that affects everybody. So I think we can look at maybe the Irish Civil War as an example of an event that's constructed as a particularly traumatic moment for the entire population. And the question there, when you mentioned the famine and the threats of famine in 1922, the difference is not that that was any more or less traumatic for the people affected than those who were affected, let's say, by war in Dublin, but it's how it was constructed as a narrative that was then absorbed and consolidated as a trauma. So we can say that in that context, that famine threat in 1922 was not perceived as a cultural drama or narrated as such. And what I'm interested in, though, is that there's a lot of examples just as there's examples of silence and uncomfortable, there's plenty of examples, as we saw with some of the examples from Bureau of Military History, there's plenty of examples of a sense of being uncomfortable with the memory of the Civil War and a desire to repress the Civil War. And we see it in the burning of papers, my personal papers. We see it also in the history books that stop suddenly, the truce, the history books in the schools in the South. We see it in numerous memoirs that just end quite suddenly. I think actually Liz edited Charlie Dalton's memoir. That's a brilliant example that only covers the War of Independence. But at the same time, what I'm interested in is there's a lot of there's silence, a lot of silence breakers, a lot of people who actually set out to challenge those silences. And that's really what the entire book is about. It's all of these examples of silence breakers. So if we just stick with that example of the famine, Peadar O'Donnell actually wrote a book, Adrigul, which was published in, I'm going to say 1929, it could be around there, it could be 26. But it's actually based around a true story in Cork of a family who starved to death due to poverty in the early 20s, and it was actually worsened because of the fact that they were in rural Cork, as far as I know, as reported in the newspapers. He saw the paper in the newspapers, and it was because the British fleet had been removed. It had moved, that the local economy suffered, and then there were cases of starvation, of a family starving, and he wrote that book Adrigul, where he transported the situation to Donegal, where he was from himself. So he actually was writing about something that had happened and maybe wasn't something that was a comfortable story to associate with the founding of the Free State. And we can say the same with the narrative of emigration. There's been a lot of more recent work on the diaspora and the global Irish Revolution. If we look at just the realities of post-Free State, post-independence, the rates of immigration in the 1920s are huge, and they're actually already huge in the period of the Civil War. I've been very interested in looking at immigration, but we can see even during the Civil War, one of the stories I found fascinating anyway was during the Civil War, obviously there was a huge amount of disruption to the roads and the railways, in that the railways were being blown up. And there's a case in Kerry where a group of local, mostly women, were trying to get to Cove to emigrate to America, and they couldn't get to Cove because of the disruptions due to the war, and they ended up making their way from the Dingle Peninsula in a small curragh boat and arriving in an absolutely dire condition, probably being at sea in very dangerous conditions. But that was the risk that they were willing to take to emigrate because of the plight of their daily lives. So I think that that's something that isn't often considered, perhaps, and we do see it somewhat in the Gaeltacht writings that Seamus O'Griana, for example, and Joseph McGreana write about the fact in their fiction, and it's often in the fiction where we see the more stronger critique, that for people in these communities, these rural communities, the economic struggle was so severe that they weren't necessarily as politicized, because it didn't matter what color the uniforms were of the soldiers, and when your more pressing concern was having food on the table. Anyway, so that's just a few thoughts on that, but to sum up, I suppose certain moments in history take on a traumatic significance due to cultural forces, I suppose, and it's really unpacking why some events take on that significance and why others don't, which makes it so interesting for us as historians, I suppose.
Yeah, it's something I think probably that we've noticed in the last couple of years, in particular, with the notion that the Spanish flu of 1918 didn't seem to take on that same cultural traumatic memory, regardless of the huge numbers of people killed and the families affected by that. And it's only, I suppose, when you're going through a global pandemic, that you begin to reflect on that a little bit more. I know people like Ada Milne and Patricia Marsh, had been working on that for years before we were actually hit with a pandemic, and then we all sort of started looking at their work more thoroughly. But yeah, there's so many examples, I suppose, of that, Síobhra. So thanks for those few that are really illustrative. There was another a point that I think it was you mentioned it, Síobhra, in Cormac Murr's recent article, that the history of the island was partitioned in 1922, as well as partition itself happening. And it's a notion that I'm personally very interested in, the whole idea of a partitioned history, post 1922 and how that was sort of translated into previous periods as well. Henry, is that a notion that you would subscribe to? You know, that the history of the island was partitioned, or would you oppose that view?
Well, certainly, if we, I wouldn't oppose the view. In fact, I've written about a sort of partitionist mentality in terms of historiography in the Republic, where historians have been, by and large, not that interested in writing about the North, for a variety of reasons. And if you look at the decade of centenaries, I do think that the Ulster, Northern Ireland tends to be a sort of afterthought almost. I don't think at the end of the decade of centenaries that much has been achieved in terms of comprehending unionism. In fact, in some ways, I think there's been a regression to positions a la, I would say, Michael Farrell's Northern Ireland, the Orange State, and not Michael Farrell arming the Protestants, which provides a much more subtle analysis of unionism than the sort of instrumentalist view of popular Protestant politics, which you get in Northern Ireland, the Orange State. So, I mean, it's essentially been left up to historians, not simply in Northern Ireland, but in other parts of the UK and further afield, really, to write about Northern Ireland unionism. I think that's still a problem on the island in terms of understanding unionism at that time and since. But also, I mean, within unionism's own, mainstream unionism's own memory, if you like, this period doesn't really exist. If you treat the unionist narrative, the emphasis is very much on 1912 or 1910 to 1914, not on the period from 1918 through 21 to 23. And the memory of incidents like Alt-Neve, which has been mentioned already, the assassination of the Unionist MP William Tweddale just before the introduction of internment, and these things have, in terms of unionist memory, it's been a question of local Orange lodges dealing with it, but mainstream unionism hasn't. And it's remarkable the lack of serious interest in the centenary, in sort of mainstream unionism, in a sense.
Speaking of William Tweddale, I've got a question for you here, Henry, from Kieran Glennon. And Kieran asks, how autonomous were the Loyalist paramilitaries really, as in disconnected from the Unionist leadership? Thinking here of the roles played by William Tweddale and the Imperial Guards or Fred Crawford with Crawford's Tigers. Yeah,
I mean, certainly, well, Tweddale, well, it's this whole question of what were the Imperial Guards, right? And, you know, you could have a whole seminar on it, as I argue a bit more at length than what I'd written for this thing. The Imperial Guards were not a Unionist death squad, although some people within them who turned up, the 20,000, may well have later been members of the Ulster Protestant Association, which we know from D.I. Spear's report 1923, was a group of about 150, as he describes it, the lowest type of Protestant hooligan element, whose main aim is the extermination of Catholics, right? Now, Twaddell was one of the speakers at the November marches and rallies. He was a very militant and sectarian loyalist. I haven't found any evidence that he was actually involved in a quote Unionist death squad, which is what Brendan O'Leary seems to be arguing in his book. So I think what I would say about the Unionist leadership in that, and what Spear's report shows up, and a very interesting Bureau of Military History statement by Michael McConnell, who was organized the IRA's first aid stations in North Belfast and Antrim during this period, and was later a doctor working as a local in loyalist areas. He was approached by a commandant of the A Specials based south of the River Lagan. And this man had been a British soldier. He joined the Specials because he thought they were a regular police force. And then he came disillusioned. And he said in his area, the main problem was the Ulster Protestant Association. Right? They were extorting what he called orange shopkeepers. He had lots of complaints. This would have been around places like Ravenhill Road, Beersbridge Road, places like that, where this UPA operated. And when he tried to get action against them, it went up and never came down again. Eventually, he used the Special Powers Act, quite ironically, to intern 20 of them. Right? So I think the key thing about if you take a hardline pogromist thing that was sort of organized from the Old Town Hall from the Unionist leadership, it wasn't, right? But you do have, for instance, Craig's condoning after the event or what had happened in the shipyards after July. Well, I think it's this awareness that Craig was aware, other Unionist leaders aware of the strength of this tradition I refer to as plebeian tradition, and their response is to try and discipline it, train it. But when individuals get, maybe former members of the people who were in this imperial guard, get into organizations like the Ulster Protestant Association, nothing really happens to them until after June 1922, when 20 or 30 of them are interned eventually. So it's this unwillingness to open yourself to divide Protestant ranks at a time of pretty chaotic conditions in Belfast that I think explains that.
Okay, thanks very much, Henry. We've got lots of questions coming in from people who are in attendance now, so I'm going to try to take them in order, and just bear with me a second as I scroll back. This is kind of open to everyone on the panel, and I don't expect you to have an answer to this. I certainly don't know the answer, but is it known how many ex-World War I Irish soldiers fought in the Civil War, and on which side, pro or anti-treaty? Does anybody want to even hazard a guess at that? I certainly don't know the answer. No,
I don't know any figures. I don't know if there's actually been a kind of numerical study, but I would just say that it didn't dictate whether they're pro or anti. So I suppose the examples are pro treaty be Emmett Dalton, who Liz has published Charlie Dalton's memoir, and then if we think of Tom Barry as an anti-treaty example, who was involved in the First World War. So I think there's a lot more examples than you realise. Also, Liam O'Flaherty, who was, I suppose, involved somewhat on the anti-treaty side, briefly, but again had been in the First World War. So maybe I don't know if anyone else can add, but there definitely were a lot.
Well, I was gonna come to you, Liz, next, Liz, if on another question, but go ahead if you wanted to come in on that.
Well, just in relation to the initial sign up to the National Army, you had to have served in the IRA, either 16 or War of Independence. So as Síobhra said, we do have the examples of a lot of World War I veterans that had joined and fought in the War of Independence, but the numbers are limited. Like the anti-treaty IRA totally outnumbered the pro-treaty IRA at the start, 1922, and that's why the provisional government were reluctant to act against the Four Courts garrison, because Paul O'Connor says like they were outnumbered like 10-1. They couldn't rely on the guys to be loyal to the National Army. But it changes after the fighting in Dublin. Once the O'Connell Street fighting sort of ends, then you have the mass recruitment open up, where you didn't have to have served, be a member of the IRA or an Fianna. It was open up to everyone. So that's where you'd have a lot more veterans that had no part played no part in the conflict before. But in terms of numbers, I don't know, but it jumps like, is it 40,000 at least you have joining the National Army, and then that leads to problems in 24 with mobilization and so on. So it's quite, I imagine there's a high percentage, but can't say for sure what the percentage would be.
Yeah, I would imagine it's one of those things that would take years of research to actually calculate when you get down to the nitty gritty of it all. But just when you mentioned there the opening up of the National Army to those without previous IRA or Fianna service, it's interesting, that there were many neutrals as well. People you referred to earlier, Liz, who crossed the border and didn't take a side in the Civil War. But another interesting one that took my interest a few years ago was that there were a group of men from the Shankill Road with military experience in the British Army, who joined the National Army, joined the Free State Army in 1922 for economic reasons, and there were many nationalists without skin in the game who joined the National Army because they needed a job. So it shows you the complexities of this, where you can have groups of men like loyalists from the Shankill Road, for example, crossing the border, and that has an impact, I suppose, on where do people fit into all of these stories and all of these positions. So it's something I wanted to just throw in there, because it's kind of related to what we're talking about, as to what Henry was talking about earlier, particularly about the cross-class alliance that was attempted to be created by the Unionist government and the Unionist movement. I'm conscious of our time. We've gone a little bit over. I'm guessing we can go a little bit more. We'll go for another 5 or 10 minutes, maybe, if that's okay. Grania, you can let me know if it's not. But we do have it's okay. Great. We've got a couple of more questions from participants that I'd like to just put to the panel. So Edward asks, has any research been done on Unionists, Loyalists, Ulster Protestants, how they reacted to or considered the extreme Civil War atrocities in the then Free State? Any reactions in private letters, committee minutes, local journalism, memoirs, etc.? It's, again, not something I've come across. Has anybody else on the panel come across Unionist reactions to Civil War events, even Civil War atrocities?
Well, the only research that I'm aware of that's been published anyway is Dennis Kennedy's book, The Widening Gulf, which looked at Unionist newspaper coverage of events on the island, really from 1918, 1919 on. But I think the focus in that book is on the experience of a number of things, but big elements, the experience of Protestants in in the South. So in that sense, there is some coverage in that book of the way the Unionist press treated what was going on in the South, and some of that related to what happened what happened, for instance, in West Cork to Protestants. And we got the whole debate, which I'm not going to go into, about Peter's Hart's article.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in on that one, or we can move on to the next question if you wish? Yeah. Okay. No problem. Martin asks us, was there an economic impact on the Free State from property business owners moving businesses out of the Free State or not rebuilding in the Free State? For example, railway owners not repairing damage from combat. Another really, really interesting question. Anybody want to come in on that one?
Stumped. We are stumped.
We're stumped. You're really, really testing our historical knowledge tonight.
It's an excellent question.
It is. It's brilliant. It's an interesting one, I think. You know, when you get down to the debates around the border, in particular, in the Boundary Commission, of, you know, where businesses that were in Northern Ireland began to question whether there was any viability in the Free State. I know, you know, in the Derry Donegal border, in particular with the textile industry, there was a great worry on the part of shirt factory owners that being outside of Northern Ireland would restrict the movement of their goods. And so that was why they argued for the city of Derry, at least, to be included within Northern Ireland and not within the Free State, as had been argued by nationalists. So those economic arguments at the time, I think, are really interesting. In terms of rebuilding from the Civil War, again, I think we should be copying down these questions and putting them to prospective PhD students maybe in years to come, because they're fascinating, really, really great. I've got a couple of comments as well that I think I'll just relate to you. Antoine says that we shouldn't forget that many took no physical part in any of the wars, and that some of the spouses of participants decided that their children would not share the divisions of their parents, notably Desmond Fitzgerald and Sean McEntee. Others were on one side and became accepting, at the very least, of the other, Liam Tobin, etc., etc. So yeah, there are those examples, and you know, there's also the one of Lamass and the story of his brother Noel, and how that was dealt with or not dealt with, as the case may be. So thanks for that, Antoine. It's another interesting comment. And Alison, who asked the question about the World War I veterans and the numbers, just to clarify that she asked the question really because she was interested in how they had experienced and then re-experienced that extreme trauma, you know, of the First World War and then the Civil War as well. And again, that's something that was reflected across Europe at the time. I think, you know, there were many wars, national wars, and different things that veterans took part in, you know, in the 1920s. So I think we've got about 10 minutes over, and we've had a very interesting conversation. There's so much more, I think, that we could have covered. But as with all of these things, we just don't have the time. But it's been really, really interesting. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the participants for your very interesting presentations, and to thank the participants, the attendees, for listening in tonight. Grania, I'll hand over to you if you'd like to finish things off for us.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, everyone. That was really, really interesting. It's great for you to get together and share your knowledge of this. That was it's really insightful. So yeah, just a massive thank you to you all. That was great. So if anyone has any more questions, there's the post-event evaluation form too. So if you've got any outstanding queries, pop them in there. But apart from that, just a massive thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Grania.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you. Goodbye.